Everything you were taught about the British Isles is wrong. Not a little wrong. Fundamentally, structurally, DNA level wrong. And the people who figured this out weren't historians. They were geneticists staring at teeth pulled from a cave in Somerset, and what they found didn't just rewrite a chapter, it shredded the entire book. Let's start with a name. Cheddar Man. Sounds like a cartoon character, right? Like some dairy-themed superhero from a children's show. But Cheddar Man is real. He lived around 10,000 years ago, and in 2018, scientists extracted his DNA and ran it. The results caused an actual scandal. Not a political scandal. A scientific one. Because Cheddar Man, the oldest near-complete human skeleton ever found in Britain, had dark skin, dark curly hair, and blue eyes. He looked nothing like the pale, ruddy-cheeked image that had been plastered on museum displays for decades. The British tabloids went berserk. But here's the thing. That wasn't even the most shocking part of what the DNA told us. The most shocking part was what came next. Who replaced him, and who replaced those people, and what that chain of replacements means for anyone alive in Britain today. For most of modern history, the story of Britain's first inhabitants was told through artifacts, flint tools, pottery shards, burial mounds, and from those objects, archaeologists built a narrative that felt solid. The first Britons came from mainland Europe after the last ice age. Then, the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. Then, the Neolithic farmers who brought agriculture. Then, the Bronze Age. Then, the Celts. Then, the Romans. Then, the Anglo-Saxons. A neat sequence, a progression. Civilization marching steadily forward like a film montage. The problem is that artifacts don't carry DNA. Artifacts tell you what people did. They don't tell you who those people actually were, where their ancestors came from, or what happened to them. And when genomics, the science of reading entire genomes from ancient remains, arrived in force around 2010 and accelerated through the 2010s, it started pulling apart that tidy narrative thread by thread. The first thing it revealed: the people who built Stonehenge were not who we thought they were. For generations, the assumption was that Stonehenge's builders were descended, in some unbroken line, from the original post-Ice Age inhabitants of Britain. Makes sense, right? Same island, continuous habitation, but the genetics say something completely different. The people who erected those massive stones around 2500 BCE were predominantly descended from Anatolian farmers, people from what is now Turkey and the surrounding region who had migrated into Western Europe and then crossed into Britain around 4000 BCE. These were the Neolithic farmers, and when they arrived, something extraordinary happened. The hunter-gatherers, who had been living in Britain for thousands of years, essentially vanished from the genetic record. Not disappeared overnight, but within a few generations, their DNA contribution to the island's population dropped to nearly zero, a near total population replacement. The first one, and far from the last. Now pause on that for a second. 10,000 years ago, Britain is populated by people like Cheddar Man, dark-skinned, blue-eyed, skilled hunters who knew every river and forest on the island. Then farmers arrive from the continent, and within what is, in evolutionary terms, the blink of an eye, the genetic signature of those original inhabitants essentially disappears. We don't fully understand why. There's no evidence of mass violence, no plague layer in the soil record, no sudden catastrophic event, just a gradual, overwhelming demographic replacement, which is disturbing in its own quiet way. 10,000 years of continuous habitation and then gone. Absorbed, outnumbered, the children of Cheddar Man became a rounding error. But the Neolithic farmers who replaced them, they didn't last either, not in their pure form, because around 2500 BCE, another wave hit the island. This one came from the Pontic steppe, the vast grasslands stretching from Ukraine to Kazakhstan. These were the Yamnaya people, or their descendants, the Beaker people, who carried Yamnaya ancestry west through Europe and eventually into Britain. They were pastoralists, they had horses. They almost certainly spoke an early form of Proto-Indo-European. the ancestral language that would eventually branch into nearly every language spoken in Europe today, including English. And when the Beaker people arrived in Britain, another replacement happened. Studies published by the Harvard geneticist David Reich and his colleagues found that within just a few centuries of the Beaker migration, the genetic profile of Britain changed so dramatically that around 90% of the Neolithic ancestry on the island was replaced. 90%. In archaeological terms, that's not immigration. That's a transformation so complete it has almost no parallel in the European record. Think about what that means. The people who built Stonehenge, the Anatolian-descended Neolithic farmers who had themselves replaced the original hunter-gatherers, were in turn almost entirely replaced by steppe ancestry migrants. Stonehenge was probably already ancient by the time the ancestors of modern Britons arrived. It was, in a very real sense, someone else's monument. And this is where the story gets genuinely strange and philosophically uncomfortable. Because when people today talk about ancient British heritage, when they invoke the deep roots of the island, when politicians speak about the timeless character of the English or the Welsh or the Scottish, the actual genetic story underneath all of that is one of almost constant replacement, migration, and transformation. There's no clean line. There's no pure origin point. The people who are in any meaningful sense the first modern Britons, genetically the ones whose DNA you can actually trace in contemporary populations, arrived around 2500 BCE, already carrying the genetic legacy of Eurasian steppe nomads and Anatolian farmers who had been mixed together for centuries before they ever set foot on the island. But let's not stop there, because the story doesn't end in the Bronze Age. After the Beaker transformation comes the Iron Age, and with it, the people we traditionally call the Celts. For a long time, there was a popular theory enthusiastically promoted, especially in Britain, that Celtic culture and language arrived with a massive wave of continental Celtic migrants who swept across the island and imposed their language on everyone. The DNA evidence has complicated this picture significantly. The genetic shift between the Bronze Age and Iron Age populations in Britain is real, but it's not as dramatic as the earlier replacements. It suggests a more complex picture: continued migration, yes, but also cultural diffusion, trade networks, elite spread of language and custom, rather than a simple population takeover. Britain in the Iron Age was still, in its genetic core, shaped by that earlier Bronze Age transformation. Then come the Romans. Fascinating from a genetic standpoint. The Roman legions stationed in Britain were extraordinarily diverse soldiers from North Africa, the Middle East, the Balkans, the Rhine frontier. Genetic studies of Roman-era burial sites in Britain have found individuals with ancestry from across the empire. One burial in York yielded a woman with ancestry that traces back to sub-Saharan Africa. Another yielded a man whose genetics match populations from the Eastern Mediterranean. This was a globalized military empire, and Britain was one of its frontier provinces. And yet, after the Romans left in the 5th century CE, their genetic contribution to the island seems to have faded. Not disappeared entirely, but the signal is subtle. The empire's lasting legacy in Britain was cultural and linguistic, not primarily genetic. Then, the Anglo-Saxons. This is where things get politically charged again, because the Anglo-Saxons are central to English national identity in a way that almost nothing else is. The very word England, Angleland, comes from this migration, and for a long time, the extent of that migration was debated. Were the Anglo-Saxons a small elite who imposed their language and culture on a largely unchanged Romano-British population, or was there a genuine large-scale population movement? The genetics have largely settled this question, and the answer is real migration, significant population shift. Studies of early medieval cemeteries show that in some parts of eastern and southern England, communities that were genetically Anglo-Saxon carrying ancestry from what is now northern Germany and Denmark make up the majority of burials within just a generation or two of the migration period. The genetic signal in modern English populations from eastern England still reflects this. It's real, it happened, it was significant. And then the Vikings and the Normans. and centuries of movement back and forth across the North Sea and the English Channel, each wave adding new layers to a genetic palimpsest that was already almost incomprehensibly complex. Here's what the modern picture actually looks like, as best as current science can reconstruct it. If you take a modern person from England, somewhere between 25 and 40% of their ancestry traces to migrations associated with the Anglo-Saxon period. A significant chunk, perhaps 30 to 40%, connects back to that Bronze Age steppe ancestry via the Beaker people. Some percentage traces to the Neolithic Anatolian farmers. And somewhere in the mix, statistically tiny but real, is a ghost of the original post-Ice Age hunter-gatherers. People like Cheddar Man, dark-skinned, blue-eyed, fishing the rivers and hunting the forests of a Briton that hadn't yet heard a single word of any Indo-European language. If you're Welsh or Scottish, the picture tilts somewhat differently. There's generally more of that pre-Anglo-Saxon genetic heritage preserved at the western and northern edges of the island, places the Anglo-Saxon migrations reached less thoroughly. But no population in Britain is genetically simple. None of them reflect a single founding moment. They are all, every single one, the product of millennia of movement, mixing, replacement, and survival. Now, why does any of this matter? Why should you care about the genetic history of an island most of you might never have visited, populated by people who died thousands of years ago? Because the story we tell about the past shapes what we believe about the present. The idea that there is some deep, ancient, racially or ethnically pure British identity, unchanged through time, rooted in a specific founding people, that idea is not just historically naive. It's genetically false. The data doesn't support it. The data tells a completely different story, one of constant movement, constant mixing, constant transformation. Britain has been a crossroads since the ice retreated. Its first modern inhabitants were steppe nomads from Eurasia. Its most iconic ancient monument was built by the descendants of Anatolian farmers. Its current English-speaking majority carries substantial genetic heritage from northern Germany and Denmark. And somewhere beneath all of it, nearly invisible now, are the echoes of people like Cheddar Man, who walked those hills in a world so different from ours, it's almost impossible to imagine. The science of ancient DNA is still young. Every year, new samples are processed, new genomes sequenced, new results published that refine or sometimes overturn previous conclusions. The field has moved with extraordinary speed. Techniques that were impossible in 2010 are now routine. And every time a new ancient British genome comes back from the lab, it adds another data point to a picture that grows more complex, more surprising, and more human. Because that's the real takeaway from all of this. Not just that the first Britons weren't who we thought, but that the very concept of first Britons is itself a simplification that collapses under scrutiny. There were many firsts, there were many peoples. There were replacements and survivals and mixings and transformations that no single narrative can contain. The island was never a sealed vessel with a fixed population. It was always, from the very beginning, part of a larger world connected to the continent, to the steppe, to the Mediterranean, to everywhere people were moving and surviving and finding new places to call home. Cheddar Man's descendants didn't disappear. Not entirely. A tiny fraction of their DNA persists in the British population today, diluted across thousands of years and dozens of migrations, but still there. The most ancient thread in a tapestry woven from dozens of different origins. And that thread connects to something remarkable, the idea that identity, ancestry, and belonging are not things that were fixed 10,000 years ago. They are things that are always being made, always being remade, always more complicated, more layered, and more interesting than any simple story can hold. If you found this as mind-bending as I did when I first went down this rabbit hole, and I genuinely couldn't stop reading for about 3 days, hit subscribe. Not because the algorithm demands it, but because this channel is built around exactly this kind of material. The moments where science dismantles a comfortable assumption and leaves something stranger and truer in its place. There's more coming on the genetics of ancient Rome, on who the Vikings actually were when you look at the DNA rather than the mythology. on what the genome of a Bronze Age steppe nomad can tell us about the origins of language itself. Drop a comment below with what you want covered next, or just tell me which part of this hit hardest. The Cheddar Man reveal tends to be the one that stops people cold. But for me, it was always the Stonehenge replacement, the idea that the people who built one of humanity's most enduring monuments were themselves almost entirely erased from the genetic record within a few centuries. History is merciless in ways we're only just beginning to measure.